we're going to wait a few seconds, friends, for the computer to add everyone to this web talk, and I'm watching the number of attendees going up, and as soon as it seems to stop, I will get us going officially. I guess that's it. Welcome everyone to the Wilmette Institute's web talk for February 18th, 2018, and today we will hear the third presentation by Reba Carruth on the spiritual destiny of America and the West. As you know, I usually start with a quick summary of the Wilmette Institute's history for those who aren't familiar with it, and I've said this so much I'll skip through it more quickly. We've now been around for 23 years, and we've been doing online programs now since 1998. This is our 20th year doing online programs. As of today, our statistics are 458 online courses and 12,075 people who've registered for those courses, give or take some, since our statistics obviously aren't perfect. They come from 123 countries, and we're really quite amazed by how people have been using these classes, giving all kinds of presentations to friends and to over the radio and on TV and all sorts of things. We think that so far this has been a very great contribution to Baha'i education, and we're very happy that you are able to join us today for yet another contribution to our study of Baha'i teachings. Today we will hear, as I said, from Reba Carruth, who has a PhD in sociology from the University of Minnesota and an MA from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs up there, and also an MA in International Affairs from American University, 1979. She's currently an adjunct professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University, and has been very involved as a interpreter at Mount Vernon, and has done other programs in the Washington, D.C. area related to the destiny of America and the American Revolution, and particularly George Washington. We've often, while we're waiting for these broadcasts to begin, Reba starts telling us about George Washington, and it's an absolutely fascinating account that she gives of all kinds of details about his life. I'm almost tempted to say, Reba, we've got to have you come back and talk about George Washington sometime, but I'm not sure if we could really quite relate it to the faith enough. I don't know. But at any rate, with that, I will transition over to Reba, and we will start watching her screen, and she will be able to begin her presentation. So I guess we'll have that switched over.
So I'll hit show my screen.
Yep.
All right. All right. So everyone, welcome for our third and final lecture in our webinar course, The Spiritual Destiny of America and the West. Today we're going to conclude with a overview, if you will, of where the last two lectures on the spiritual destiny of America and the West have taken us. And ultimately it takes us to this place where the Baha'i writings, particularly Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi, say that essentially the spiritual enlightenment that rises and emerges in the East will be and will ultimately flow from the West. Now, the quote you have in front of you is that the sun of spiritual enlightenment rises in the East, but the power of God is shed and manifested in the West. Now, what that ultimately means is that not that the West is better than the East or that the East is better than the West, but it essentially speaks to what we have talked about, or what I've talked about in this course, in terms of the mobilization of the West in terms of institutions, individuals, movements, normative cooperation that manifests itself in the domain of government, society, and industry and science. Ultimately, Baha'u'lláh is saying that through the splendors of the faith, in other words, these principles of the Baha'i faith, the West will be able to move even further and will be able to radiate and ultimately promote these teachings on a global level. Now, achievement of Baha'i faith spiritual principles and universal teachings in Christian faith nations of America and the West. What exactly does this bring us to in the 21st century? Now, the oneness of mankind, unity of races, peoples, nations, faith under God, that is the main principle of the Baha'i faith. Baha'u'lláh says this is the pivotal principle around which all other principles revolve. Ultimately, this is what the concept or the framework of world society is bringing. And that is something that emerges from the West. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But ultimately, that is the view that all peoples, through contact, whether they be through warfare, through trade, through migration or whatever, ultimately, they have to reconcile their differences and adapt common structures for integration and creation of a community, a society. And ultimately, these societies have to be able to also construct nations that in turn create a community of nations. Equality of men and women. What we see is that the Christian countries, like other countries of other faith traditions, have some strengths and have some weaknesses. But ultimately, in the Christian countries, what we see is that women have been a force for transforming society. And when we get to America, what we see is that the women from the beginning were central in the creation of the country. We didn't have time to talk about this in extreme detail, but what we see is Queen Isabella of Spain basically empowering Columbus, funding Columbus to make this historic voyage with the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria to the New World. He thinks he's in India, but essentially he lands in the Americas, which begins a new phase of interaction and expansion of the Western structures into this new world called the Americas. Unity and freedom of religion, right? This is a principle which the Western countries, and certainly with the creation of the United States, we see is central to the establishment of world society and world peace. Now, what this also means is that increasingly, it's not just enough for the European countries or American countries, not just the United States or countries in the Western Hemisphere to adopt this, but increasingly going forward, this is something that is an obligation and requirement of all nations and peoples. We tend to think of everything being the Europeans or the white people versus everyone else, but that is not the case. There is also an issue on religious freedom and religious tolerance across other faith traditions and among other races and groups of people. So you can have people of the same faith tradition and there can still be conflict among those people based on different points of view of theology, based on different ethnicity, different race. So it's not enough just to look at it from the prism of racial unity or national unity, but also looking at what religion brings us in terms of the unity and diversity of peoples. Universal education. Education, as we see from the point of view of the emergence and evolution of the West in America, is central. Lack of moral education creates a problem because that erodes the foundations of universal community, which are central for the cohesion and integration and solidarity of societies and cooperations between nations. Civic development is also related to universal education. We have to have education according to the Baha'i teachings, but also according to the traditions of the Western countries that helps us to understand our role in society and how we can contribute to society. And that's something that's often misplaced and misunderstood. It's not just knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Once again, we're living in a time when education and training is really seen as something that is necessary for the uplifting of individuals and citizens and of communities and nations. Unity of science and religion through reason. Now, in the Baha'i writings, we see that science is elevated as something that is necessary for understanding the mysteries and the wonders of God and the universe. In fact, Baha'u'lláh says that there is a knowledge that is so powerful that once it's obtained, all other study and knowledge becomes irrelevant. Now that is very powerful because it also gives an indication that there is a close intercorrelated, interrelated structure of all living things, of the universe, plant, human, animal. And once it is recognized and tapped into, everything else becomes really nice to know, but really it is nowhere near as important as that realization. Independent investigation of truth. Now, one thing that I have to say, you know, we're living in a time in Europe and America where things are definitely in transition and in chaos. But somehow, from what we've looked at in the last two lectures and webinars when we've been together, what we see is that the Western people seem to be able to, in some ways, get going in the midst of confusion and upheaval that forces them to continue to move forward and to try to resolve and reconcile the problems. And that requires more and more investigation of different ways of doing things. So in some ways, when we look at the West and the spiritual destiny of America and in the West, what we see is that the West provides a mechanism for synthesizing a lot of diverse ideas, bodies of knowledge, indigenous knowledge, knowledge from other parts of the world, knowledge from other viewpoints, and to come to a decision based on what is valid and what is useful that can be used and built into a system that is going forward. Socio-economic justice based on rule of law, rights, and responsibilities. So the Baha'i faith acknowledges that pure equality among people, or even within a family, does not exist. What exists is their equality, or the equality of all people in the eyes of God and under the rule of law. So here again, what we see is that in many ways, when the system of law begins to be eroded, or when it no longer can address emerging problems or challenges, there has to be a recalibration, which is what we're seeing now, not just in the Western world, not just in what's going on in America, but increasingly we're seeing this as something that is universal. So I think in some ways, when we look at what the West was able to achieve and what it was able to give to the world, and ultimately how America and the countries of the Americas were formed and were able to take parts of what was indigenous to here and parts of what was built in Europe and go forward, I think that is the future. Being able to build on things that are relative and valid from the past, but not being blocked by them, and being able to see a new reality, a new future. Now, the other thing is the West and America have been instrumental in providing mechanisms for achieving things. So in other words, we talk about goal-directed behavior. If we take one principle here, universal common language, all right? If there's a characteristic of the West, of Europe over the centuries, of America and Europe in a transatlantic structure between Europe and the Americas, it's the need for finding common structures and standards for doing things. The Baha'i faith says we have to find a universal common language. It also says that the mother tongue can be spoken at home, there's no problem with that, but common language in public becomes important because that becomes the mechanism through which we can integrate a wide variety of things. So in many ways, we can see that America and Europe, and ultimately what the Western world, which is based on these core foundations of universal community, have given, are valid in many ways. They just have to be, in many ways, recalibrated to meet the spiritual and the practical goals and requirements of our age. Now let's look at oneness of mankind, unity of races, peoples, faiths, and nations. The one thing I have to say is that there tends to be, not just in the West, but also in the East and other parts of the world, there tends to be a desire to choose one or two of these things, but not all of these things. So there are people who are focused on unity of peoples and faiths, but they're not interested in unity of nations because they feel that takes away their freedom, their autonomy. Some people are interested in unity of faiths and nations, but they're not interested in unity of races. They don't want to be reminded that the human race has many different characteristics and varieties, all right? Because they feel that if they acknowledge that, somehow they're not where they want to be. But what all of this has shown us is that ultimately there can be no unity of mankind without unity across these elements. And this is where I believe America and Europe and the West have a lot more to give. Not that they are responsible for all of this, but that they are able to provide mechanisms through which others outside of these areas can also begin to move forward locally and nationally and regionally. If we look at the European Enlightenment, what we see is an alignment of faith and reason for humanity. So in other words, trying to understand how reasoning can be aligned with the higher principles and the higher goals of morality, which are given through our faith and from our belief in God, which is a type of balancing. The Baha'i faith is really also alluding to this role of balance and moderation in all things. That's what Baha'u'lláh talks about as well in many different ways. But I think in many ways, we have not appreciated or we have not thanked Europe enough for providing that framework, that mechanism through which to look through reality and through which we can approach the development of society and nations. Certainly by the time we get to the American Declaration of Independence, we see a full acknowledgement of God and the God-given rights that are inalienable, that are endowed upon all people. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with inalienable God-given rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Again, this is building on the accumulation of traditions and bodies of knowledge and philosophy, which ultimately find that there is a oneness, there's a commonality, which has to be brought forward, in this case, through the American nation. Adoption of the four freedoms. Here again, we see during the time of war that realignment and refocus on what becomes in many ways the principles within which people and societies and nations can come together and have a unified and a collective approach to life and coexistence. These four freedoms were freedom of speech, freedom of religion, again, showing up again in the Western world, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. Now, this came from the State of the Union address of President Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. And later, it becomes part of the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A lot of you don't realize this, but this was being developed even while the war was still going on. And at that time, race, sex, language, and religion became focal points, if you will, for this body of universal law. So that's very interesting, but it also speaks to the central role of America and Europe in helping to establish this standard, this banner around which now all nations and peoples and races and faiths have to work. Global Commonwealth. We speak about Global Commonwealth very often because the colony of Virginia was created as a Commonwealth. Commonwealth also appears when we look at imperial structures of Europe. But in the 21st century and going forward, Global Commonwealth is just that, global. And that was something that Europe didn't have a strong hand in. They didn't see the others as being equal to them. They were in many ways part of their domain, the extension of their domain in the other continents, but they kept a special place for themselves. So the challenge going forward for the West in terms of its spiritual destiny is to move from this position of them and us, and to recognize that while we retain the right to our own identity and our own systems of governance and society and law, that we have to be able to allow the others to also build in these areas. Now, when we talk about common norms and laws, government policies and standards, a lot of times these were developed by one or two countries and they were adapted by the others. And that's not a bad thing. We can't have 150 countries or 200 systems or structures. When we talk about languages, Baha'u'lláh says languages are a waste of time. You need to come to one and use that. Well, it's the same way in many ways when we look at bodies of law, whether it's public law, where you're looking at things that are in the public domain, or private law, where you're looking at things in the private or the business or the market domain. There comes a point where you have to have agreement on what is more efficient, what is more advantageous for all the people. Now, when we look at Commonwealth, we're also looking at social and economic development and integration. Again, this is goal-directed action that each country is now responsible for. So in other words, when we looked at the evolution of the Christian nations of the West, when we look at the creation of the colonies in the Americas, what we saw was very, in some ways, conflicting. On the one hand, this notion of global community didn't fully extend equally to these new nations, or initially these colonies that became nations in the Americas. But now what we see is that there is formalization of this structure of community of nations in the Americas as well as in Europe. So what this means is that global Commonwealth going forward requires that the other regions are also required now to build these goal-directed structures and frameworks for social and economic development for their peoples and their nations, not just at the local level and national level, but also at the regional level. And that brings us to market, industry, and trade regulation. One of the problems is that when we looked at Commonwealth before, it was for the Commonwealth of the Western powers. And now we're living in a time where you have this issue of Commonwealth also being seen as something that's being designed for the interest of Eastern powers, which is also not acceptable, because we have to make sure that each country and region has its own set of market and industry and trade goals and social and economic development goals, which in the end are there to benefit them and enrich them, not just to be there to enrich others, whether they're in the West or in the East. But in order to do that, what we see is that this pooling of science, this pooling of technology, and this mobilization of markets and trade is something that in many ways has to be seen in the context of the local as well as the context of the global. We're living in a time where in many cases globalization is seen as something that is not desirable because it seems to be uncontrolled. But in the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'lláh makes it very clear that we're at a point where there is a need for all the rulers and leaders and kings and queens and guardians of nations to come together and decide what is in the best social and economic interest of their peoples. So here again, you know, the market is not in and of itself the goal, it's the mechanism. Industry is not in and of itself the goal, it's a tool. And trade is not in and of itself the only path for communication and consolidation and solidarity of people. But these are definitely mechanisms that are necessary, and they require the if you will, the innovation of many of these systems that were put into place by Europe and then eventually by America. And in fact, Abdu'l-Baha talks about this in a very interesting way. He says, the people of Europe and America have been uplifted by education and training from the world of defects. In other words, they focused historically on solving problems, and that is what in many ways led to their ability to move quickly and to move in a more dramatic and extensive way than some of the other civilizations and cultures that preceded them. In other words, targeting your problems and then targeting your shared problems tends to be the way forward in terms of finding a way to have shared benefit, or in this case, global commonwealth. Now, this brings us to world society. Now, world commonwealth is one thing, but world society is necessary for world commonwealth. And this is where Europe really led the way in terms of establishing the framework, which now has to be, in some ways, extended and innovated for achieving this world order and world society. Now, world society is basically a framework that is put into motion by a Dutchman by the name of Grotius. And you don't have to worry about this because I'm going to be giving you the final list of suggested readings and websites that you can go to, and you'll have that on the website later. But Grotius is the Dutch man that basically is pulling from his Christian theological roots, his European philosophical roots, to really see that warfare at a certain point in time became the way that people encountered each other. And after a certain point, it's no longer efficient. So in the writings, Abdu'l-Baha talks about how during the Crusades, the Western European powers and countries and Christian nations went to the Middle East and sacked all these countries and nations. And it was basically instigated by the fact that they were getting reports of the mistreatment of Christian communities in the Middle East. And this continued for several years. But he talks about how after all of this warfare, they went back to Europe and bought many of the things that they had witnessed there and learned there and applied them to Europe. Now, what Mr. Grotius began to see was that this is not efficient because you're essentially destroying a source of new knowledge and of wealth and of community. And you can bypass that by shifting to peace through international cooperation. Hedley Bull was another one who saw this as something that also had to be addressed from the point of view of moving from anarchy, where you've got so much diversity in the way people are living, thinking, the way they're organized, to a point of commonality, where you're working on your shared interest and you're working together to defend against shared threats. And finally, Barry Buzan, who takes world society to the realm of international relations, or what is called the English School. We just can't seem to get away from that British Empire, but probably because the British Empire was the most extensive globally, that they were able to pull from so many places in so many ways and synthesize so many different things from such a wide and diverse range of civilizations, bodies of knowledge and science, philosophy, industry, so on and so forth. But basically what this gives us is a framework where we can move forward and have multi-level international cooperation. We're living in a time where America and Europe have in place these movements which allow parliamentarians to form networks. A lot of people don't realize that, but there are networks where representatives of governments now from across the world, not just between Europe and America, but on a worldwide basis, come together and they work on their shared problems. So they can be networks of environmental regulators or food safety regulators or treasury and finance regulators or policymakers. We have that with industry. We also have that with civil society. You know, looking at how we can, for example, deal with things like climate change or things like urban development, infrastructure, things like that. In order to have world society, you have to have common norms, which requires rule of law. Here again, in international relations, we see international agreement and international cooperation based on international public law and international private law, where you are harmonizing the laws of nations based on shared common norms. So that doesn't mean that every law and regulation is worded exactly the same, but their impact and goal has to be the same. So each country can have its own set of laws and rules, but they have to ultimately be based on this shared common norm or set of values where they're going to the same place. Collective security against shared threats. Now, unfortunately, this is where unity of peoples and world society really has come forward historically. You know, when things are going good, it's nice to get together and talk about how well they're going good, but it's really when you have shared threat that requires collective action that you see that the peoples and nations of the world are coming together. When you have the League of Nations, it's because you see the horrific threat that is being posed by biological and chemical warfare, which was witnessed in World War I. You're trying to avoid it. You're trying to see how you can work on the social and economic problems which lead to these wars, which have become more and more catastrophic in scale and scope. One of the biggest areas of collective security was the mobilization of nations in the format of world society against infectious diseases. And now you see it being carried out in terms of climate change and environmental protection. Because again, regardless of where you live or how you're living, locally or nationally or regionally, at the end of the day, this is a threat that will not go away. It respects no person, it respects no nation, and the destination it will take you to can basically be terminal. So this is where historically collective security and world society have come together. This is why in terms of world mobilization, you see the strongest success. You know, for example, with mobilization for public health, you're seeing it now with climate change, regardless of resistance by certain leaders and certain industry people. More and more, you see that it's beginning to be clear that domestic security, food security, air and water quality, all these things are now under threat because of this bigger sort of disaster that is occurring in the natural environment. And it involves not just the people, but also the animals and the plants. Harmonization of national and regional rules of law for collective good and protection of society, for the establishment of Commonwealth and nations. Clearly, this is something that Europe gave the world. But I think when we look at the future of world society, what America gives the world and what makes America's destiny so important is that it shows how you can start as an insignificant, non-recognized entity, because that's what we were. We were a colony, and you can stand and rise. And that is the message to all people. It doesn't matter how low you are, but you can rise to the highest heights. All right. And in order to do that, you have to be able to put into place structures and enforce structures that are based on the public good. Because essentially that's what Commonwealth is. It's the mobilization of markets and trades for the public good. of society and economy within nations. Now, world peace. This was the other dimension of the destiny of America and the West. So you have unity of peoples, establishment of Commonwealth, which requires world society and international agreement. When we look at world peace, it's not just tolerance. It's not just the absence of war. It's active moral and normative agreement to achieve world peace. Because time and time again, when we look at the history of Europe, when we look at transatlantic conflict between Europe and America, it's an ongoing process, all right? Even after the Revolutionary War, the British lingered here. We could not get them out. They come back in 1812 and burn down the Capitol, all right? During the Civil War, they're hanging around the southern states, waiting for them to possibly be successful in breaking the Union so that they can come back, which is what George Washington warns about. He says, confederation is not enough. You have to have union. So here again, what we're looking at is a future where world peace requires moral and normative agreement across the regions of the world which Europe has historically seen as not being equivalent. Now, where does this bring us to in terms of world society? One of the contributions that we will see with world society and with Mr. Grotius and Barry Buzan and Hedley Bull is that world society requires structures of integration and cooperation among peoples that transcend race, transcend religion, transcend nations in order to create this in many ways, peaceful coexistence. So having interaction just through warfare or because of the anarchy that is created through warfare is no longer manageable. What is necessary is having a lasting, established, or what Baha'i writings call a world peace, a great peace, a most great peace, within which this integration and mobilization of peoples into a global community can occur. In the Baha'i writings, it's also said that unilateral disarmament is not safe or successful. A lot of people are always saying, well, if Europe and America would just give up their weapons, everyone else would follow suit, and then the world would be a safer place. But Baha'i writings is very clear about this. Baha'u'lláh is very clear about this. Sedition exists. Right? People and movements and forces will use structures of nations, particularly open nations, for their own purposes. You have movements that also do this. You know, they purport to be addressing one thing and it looks nice on the surface, but then when you get further into it, it really is subversive. So universal disarmament is not something that is being requested here. What is being requested is the shift of focus of world society away from industry and weapons development and to the resolution of social and economic disparities and development. So in the biblical sense, it's turning swords into plowshares. Why? Because the farmer and agriculture is the source of life. The sword may be necessary up to a point to protect stability of a nation and of world society, but it's not enough. Finally, international law enforcement. Baha'u'lláh talks about enforcement of laws by rulers and nations. Law is what basically is necessary for justice. It raises the spiritual and moral standards that are given by God to the people through the prophets. And that's why when Baha'u'lláh talks about this, he's very clear about the fact that there is no substitute for this in terms of achieving world peace. He goes on to say the great being wishes to reveal the prerequisites of world peace, or essentially peace and tranquility in the world, and the advancement of the people. He says the time has come when the necessity of holding a vast and all-embracing assembly of men will be universally realized. Now that's something that's very important. universally realized. What tends to happen is that either the great powers or the regional powers have historically wanted to do things, they've wanted to impose it on the others. We also live in a time when people who feel that they are historically oppressed refuse to carry out their obligations to their people, or they want to blame their situation totally on decisions or actions of the past, or decisions or goals of the others. And that is something that's not acceptable in the age in which we live. Everybody is responsible. Every nation is responsible. Every ruler is responsible. And ultimately, every citizen and person is responsible for achieving this great peace. Now, what does this mean for the spiritual destiny of America and the nations of the Americas? As I said before in our last sessions, all of the nations of the Americas were colonies of Europe. They were formed from the coming together of the Europeans with the indigenous native Indian people and the peoples of Africa. So that means that they, in many ways, have flexibility that doesn't exist in older civilizations, because they're able to use things from the European and the synthesized knowledge and traditions are coming from the Eastern traditions through Europe and through Christianity. But they're also able to use indigenous knowledge coming from the native people and the African people. And going forward, what is interesting is that the Americas and Africa have massive land and natural resource endowment. And where is industry and wealth creation ultimately coming from? It's coming from the earth. It's coming from nature. We're living at a time where we're once again seeing Europe and America focusing on the cyclical economy. So in other words, once you take things from the earth, minerals, plant life, animal life, transform that into products, food, materials for industry, you can deconstruct it and return it back to the earth to create this continuous cycle. So that's very fascinating, because that's taking ancient knowledge, that's taking indigenous knowledge, and then placing it as the if you wanted to say it, the zeitgeist, the spirit of world commonwealth, which has to be sustainable and based on renewable and sustainable environment. We see that Baha'u'lláh is saying to the rulers of America and the presidents of the republic therein to adorn their temple of dominion with the ornament of justice and the fear of God. Now, one thing that's very interesting is that with all the problems that are going on in America, all the problems that are going on among the countries in the Americas, we are not ashamed to say that we believe in God. It is not the case in Europe. What you're seeing in Europe now is that the Europeans are beginning to realize that they put God behind them under the belief that secularization or technocratic leadership, where you're just relying on science and evidence and whatever, and you just sort of see religion as something that's nice, or faith as something that's nice but not necessary. It sort of broke the equilibrium that was created through the Enlightenment, where you have these two things linked. Now you're beginning to see that even in Europe, there's a recognition that at the end of the day, even if you argued all the points that you're trying to argue to achieve social and economic development, to achieve world peace, to achieve Commonwealth, you still have to have something higher above men, above society, above nation, to reach that place of unity. And that is what is fascinating, that the people of the Americas were able to stand as people who had no standing, and to have all these endowments placed at their disposal. And I think what we see today is that there's a belief that the people with the most science, the people with the most money, will be the ones that will lead the world and rule the world. But keep in mind, the Bible says the meek shall inherit the earth. And we never hear really much about the people of the Americas or the people of Africa, unless it's in some dramatic way, trying to illustrate how they're not at the same level of the Europeans or the Asian power. So I think that's very interesting, that Baha'u'lláh recognizes and gives authority and a leadership role to America and the Americas. Now, destiny of America, from colony to great power. The responsibilities and destiny of America in the context of the West is to be the nation that raises that banner and standard, or the standards for the oneness of mankind, unity of races, peoples, faiths, and nations. So it will build on and is building on these traditions that have been accumulated in Europe from across the world. But in many ways, it's the American traditions that are leading the way in terms of establishing this recognition across nations and peoples and faiths. And I think, again, in the Baha'i writings, where the racial unity between the Black and the white people, between the white people and the Black people and the indigenous people, I think the way Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi are articulating this make it clear that in many ways they represent the scope of diversity of peoples. Because in every nation you have these dualities, right? You have disunity based on color. You have disunity based on wealth and knowledge and power. You have disparities based on the claims and the rights of the indigenous people versus the interests and the rights of people who have migrated and come in. And most nations are comprised of a combination of all of this, right? And we're only now beginning to realize that people are, because of the DNA that is able to identify the fact that most people are coming from so many different places and parts of the world, historically, that we're able to now have people begin to address this and talk about this. But this is something that the American people have put into motion. And this is something, again, when you look at the growing movement and power of the indigenous people worldwide, that is coming from the mobilization of the indigenous people in the Americas, and the fact that the indigenous people and Native American tribes help the colonists stand and to win the Revolutionary War and to build this great nation, to lead the world and to lead the nation in international cooperation. The fact that we were a colony and also our world power is significant. I think in many ways, we have a period of time in which we live in which people who ruled others are seen as completely untrustworthy, unreliable, and unsafe as partners for cooperation. Where America and the nations of the Americas are useful is that we are able to, in many ways, broker lines that others can't. Finally, to facilitate the achievement of world peace. Well, if we look at this quote by Abdu'l-Baha, what we see is that in many ways, people from a low station are able to rise and are able to, in his words, have crowns that are studded with jewels. Having a crown and having a crown studded with jewels indicates nobility. And I think it's from that point of view that the destiny of America becomes significant. And it resonates with people who are at the highest and the lowest levels of society and are in that spectrum of nations that are in many ways less developed to all the way through nations that are the most developed. Now let's conclude here. I talked too long last time, I'm talking too long now, but I just want to conclude our webinar and leave time for comments here with these following points. It's very clear that Christianity did provide a very important spiritual foundation for the creation of Europe and the Americas and what is now this transatlantic region between America and Europe, and the Americas and Europe. Now, part of that is also because of the fact that the individual, the citizen, community, are all considered to be the viable elements of nations, and therefore have to be respected and are given status and rights. And we talked about this in terms of the Bill of Rights, and these other things last time we were together, you know, and I sent you some links for that. But those are revolutions where individuals and citizens and communities are recognized as having a voice and can speak to power. So again, I think in many ways, these are things that are underestimated and underappreciated at this point, because we live in a world where everyone is after everyone else. But in many ways, many people now are in a position where if they want to investigate the future and the possibility of a world society and world commonwealth and world peace and the oneness of mankind, they can find the tools that they need through this evolution that occurred through Europe and America, coming from this foundation and recognition of the need for universal community, which is what came from the Christian teachings. Now, the other thing is that in Europe and America, there is now a reconciliation underway among the different factions and theological bodies of the Christian faith. Now, at Georgetown University, where I'm an adjunct faculty member, we have a Berkeley Center. And one of the things that's very interesting now is that you're seeing that the Russian Orthodox Church, for example, is now being looked at as a focus for international cooperation in the Eastern world. Now that's fascinating because it took a long time even for Christianity to be reestablished and recognized in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. But what do we see? We see not only the re-embracing of the Orthodox Church by the Protestant and Catholic Church, but once again, a recognition that these principles are important going forward to have peace and stability and unity of peoples in Eastern Europe and in the East. So ultimately, this brings us to the Baha'i faith. What the Western world and America and the people of the Americas need at this point is knowledge and understanding of what Baha'u'lláh is bringing in terms of principles and writings and teachings. We have a book of Revelation in the Christian faith, which basically says that everything that we're experiencing now is going to happen. But on the other side of it will be one who will bring us to all truth. And that's where America and the West have to go. They have to now focus on this next chapter, which is opening at the end of the book of Revelation in the New Testament. And that's another reason why when Abdu'l-Baha is asked, and some answer questions, what do you call a good Christian? He says a Baha'i. So I just want to conclude today by saying that we can build on our shared Christian traditions in Europe and America. We can't run from them, but we have to build on them. And we have to work with others and not be ashamed of our traditions, which sometimes happens in the desire to please others. We sometimes throw behind our backs what is necessary to put in front of us. But the West and America have the ability to work with the others and to move forward and accelerate the achievement of world society, world commonwealth, and world peace. In order to do that, the first leg of this spiritual destiny of America and the West will be to achieve that oneness of mankind. So I just want to thank you for being with us for this webinar. I'm going to turn it over to our chairs here, and please keep in touch. I'd love to hear from you, and you can always contact me if you have any questions or if you're interested in any new developments.
Thank you so much, Reba. This is a fascinating conclusion to your series, your series of 3 presentations. And I don't see any questions yet, but we may have some shortly. I was struck by the fact that you gave that passage from Baha'u'lláh about the call for a universal meeting of men, and that the kings and rulers of the world need to achieve it. And in the year 2000, there was a Millennium Summit in New York with many kings and rulers of the different countries of the world. So we've already seen one time where that particular call of Baha'u'lláh has been fulfilled. And I was wondering if you had any comments about that, or whether you think we will have this more regularly, or what?
I think one of the things that has been put in motion is this need for rulers to come together for goal-directed ends. And coming together is very important, but I think that what has to happen is that they have to come together specifically to work on the shared needs and threats facing their peoples.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really important. And it's not to say that there haven't been gatherings of kings and rulers. Certainly in the Baha'i faith, we have this race unity and race amity conference, which was historic, which Abdu'l-Baha sets into motion. And that was based also on a conference that was convened in London back in the late 19th century, where they were convening all the heads of their colonial territories to come to London to talk about how we can start seeing this common shared vision of a common world, a commonwealth, but not based on grievance. And you see, this is when you look at these international gatherings now, what do you see? You see people boycotting because they have grievance, either with their government or with some other government or nation or peoples or whatever. I think what Baha'u'lláh is talking about, and what definitely will occur, because we are certainly facing threats that did not exist even 10 years ago. All right. What we will be seeing is governments coming together and rulers and kings to come together to specifically achieve this oneness based on the recognition of shared rights and obligations of rulers to the ruled, and rights and obligations of citizens to the community and to their nation. So I think that is what is very interesting. Baha'u'lláh is really very precise in giving the indications of what the context will be of these meetings, of these decisions. And once again, the shared threat is the instability and the threat of anarchy. And the last set of suggested readings and web links, there was from the Library of Congress, you saw those murals. Anarchy is the most scary, because what do you have? A disheveled man, a crazed man. The books are trampled on, not just books of knowledge, but the holy books. And we know that from the Baha'i writings and from the other faith traditions, but also from Christianity, spiritual education is what brings order.
Yeah. Well, I think you make a good point that the Millennium Summit is not the only summit. In a way, the Paris Accord, where climate change is concerned, is an example of the many kinds of summits that are happening now, which do exactly as you say, focus on the specific problems of the world and help solve the problems of the groups of people's conditions. So yeah, I think that you have a good point there. Vida Wakob writes, "Thank you for this wonderful presentation." So we've got that particular feedback that has just appeared. And I wanted to ask you another question, because you talked about the positive strengths of the West and of the United States of America particularly, to help lead the world in these important directions of establishing world peace and justice and equality of all peoples. I was wondering if you have any kind of a comment about Shoghi Effendi's statement that the administrative order was established in the West because it was in America because it was the most corrupt place, I guess, politically, and that the faith arose in Iran because it was the most corrupt society in the world or on the earth. It's kind of an interesting contrast to the positives and to the strengths that we also have that particular statement by I guess it's Abdul Baha. What do you think about this? Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi said these things. So, have you any comments about that?
Well, I think I think last time we were together, you mentioned that the Persian Empire was in its day the most extensive and the most powerful empire of its time, and that is in and of itself a statement that speaks to organization, that speaks to wealth, that speaks to development in arts and sciences. In the case of America, you know, it's coming from the opposite direction. All right. We start as a market before we have a society and a nation. So all of these things were absent here. So that means that to be the most corrupt nation means that in a way you are spiritually bankrupt. Money rules, human life, the higher nature of man, all of that is trampled on because of the love of money. All right. I mean, obviously, when we look at what happened to the indigenous people, I mean, they are in many ways oppressed because it's a fight over what? Over territory. Yep. Land, wealth. Where's the wealth? All right. So they get, for example, they get pushed on to bad lands. You know, and you go west, it's called the Badlands because they were bad. It was bad agricultural land. So it was decided to put them on those lands and to keep the good farmlands and ranch lands for the white settlers. Now it turns out there's all this mineral wealth under these Badlands.
That's right.
See, so you know, so that's one thing. And then you had this problem, for example, with sheep and cattle herders. There's a documentary on PBS some time ago about how after the Civil War, you had all this westward expansion because President Lincoln not only consolidates North and South, he consolidates East and West. And that's when you have the expansion of the railroad. You have the big, what they call robber barons, you know, who are establishing these big enterprises. And it's really Teddy Roosevelt who has to come in and put the antitrust structures in place. All right. So I don't think it's Shoghi Effendi's imagination, because he's historically close to that period where the progressives who are pulling from the left and the right, or the Democratic and the Republican structures, the progressives are working to push back these corrupting structures which threaten the viability of the nation. Mm-hmm. All right. So I don't think, though, that it means that America is inherently corrupt to the point where it is evil, because Abdul Baha and Baha'u'lláh are saying the opposite. The warning, and I think that that's how Shoghi Effendi's writing should always be seen. He's basically discussing the writings of Abdul Baha and Baha'u'lláh. All right. The warning is that was a fundamental element that resulted in the creation of the country. It was the corruption that was occurring from the British Empire in the extraction of all this wealth here, the enslavement of the people from Africa, bringing them here specifically to provide all this wealth, the sending of these white indentured, primarily Celtic people, to get them out of England. So that's the Irish and the Scottish, and the disenfranchisement of these Indian nations, which was part of the strategy, right? All of that is historically there. But what happens is, through the amalgamation of all these different peoples and practices, they're able to come up with something higher than anyone expected. And that is really what is happening here. You know, when we talk about disciples, what is Christianity showing us? Again, it's showing us people who had nothing, were considered nothing, are able to, through spiritual impulse and teaching, rise to the highest level. So that's where it is, you know. When you compare Persia to the American situation, the similarity is this reality of power, but they're coming from different directions. In fact, Abdu'l-Baha says there is no connection between America and Persia at a certain point. In other words, they're totally different, but that's why in many ways they have a lot that they can learn from each other. Again, what is the West doing? It is learning and pulling from different structures, picking what is valuable and important for the context in which it's operating and projecting it back out to the world.
Marco Oliveira in Portugal asks about the European Union and whether the European Union might be a possible model for this future world federation. He notes that that the European Union has a elected legislature, and the legislature, of course, then has a European Commission that's approved by the European Parliament, but the members of the Commission are proposed by the governments of Europe and this sort of thing. So there's quite a structure in place in Europe, and he was wondering what you thought of that.
I think, thank you, Marco, so much for that question. It's a very important question. I think Europe has always led the world in this process of building institutions and the innovation of institutions. Because institutions are also a repository of norms and morality, if you will, for society and nations. Now, what the European Union is doing is showing regions, which are comprised of small countries, powerful countries, mid-range countries, showing what is necessary and possible in terms of having what you call multi-level cooperation and governance. So the individual nation very often can't solve all of its problems on its own. Self-sufficiency is required because you do need a certain amount of self-dependency. You can't just rely on what's going on the other side of the world or what your neighbor is doing. You have to be able to mobilize core fundamental things for your people and for yourself. But at the end of the day, you have to have cooperation with your neighbors, because very often in history, that's who you're fighting with.
Yeah.
So I think the European Union is very valuable for understanding what groups of nations that share a territory or region, geographical region, have to do in order to integrate and have a collective reality. And I think that we talk about America, but the power of the West also is related to the fact that Europe early on was able to recognize how, in many ways, it needed to build based on the needs and interests of the European people, not always looking at what it can grab from somewhere else, but what it needed to do to make sure that society had solidarity within the borders of the nations. And in many cases now, what you see with the European Union is that they have very specific areas of policy cooperation. So if you go through all the strategic sectors, agriculture, industry, science and technology, medicine or whatever, I mean, education, they really have shown the world that In fact, this is really a level of security and community that has been up until now underdeveloped. And this is where Europe is in many respects leading the way, more so than America. We have an organization of American states, and it is very much influenced by the European model and tradition of conferences. That's what Europe did. It convened conferences of rulers and nations to address shared problems and shared threats. And I'll put a link to that, as well as a link to the European Union on the attachment.
Good. Yeah, and Marco also notes that we also have the existence of the African Union and Mercosur in southern South America as parallel efforts to the European Union, and presumably these particular organizations will also gradually expand in the authority that they have, that has been given to them by their member states, and the coordination that those states are maintaining together will presumably also increase.
Well, you see these regional bodies are existing now in every region. In the Gulf region, you have a Gulf Cooperation Organization. Same thing is happening there. You know, in every region of the world, you are seeing regional and sub-regional coordination and cooperation.
Yep. East Asia too.
Yes.
Has a
ASEAN, APEC. With APEC, well, see, the other thing is too, you have in world society and world unity, you have multi-level structures. You have the local, you have the state or province, you have the national, you have the regional, and then you have the global. Ultimately, everything now is being organized so that it can converge across region, across nations, and converge across a global system. That's that world society structure which Europe gave the world. Now, historically, world society was driven and organized by Europeans for the European interest in the other countries. So fighting infectious diseases was with these sanitary conferences. I'll send a link to that as well. That was the first cooperation for trade regulation, public health regulation, science cooperation to target these infectious diseases, and also to move on public sanitation and public infrastructure in the European countries. That was because these empires were so far flung around the world. The movement of all these agriculture-based goods and minerals and things, where you open the earth and you're moving things, people, animals, plants, that is moving these pathogens. So that created a framework for regional and global cooperation by nations on this world society model. But I think now the challenge for Europe and America and the West is to be very clear with the other nations and regions about what is required for themselves as a region and what is required of them in each of their nations. It's not just the deliverance of goods and aid from other countries. It's also what you have within your country that has to be deployed, mobilized, and in many ways constructed to address the social and economic development goals, to address the need for science and technology, to address shared problems and common threats, and so on and so forth. So yes, Marco, this is definitely exactly where this is.
That's good. Yeah, Marco says thank you also for your response. Brian, all comments that he suggests that we watch the video on this YouTube channel of the Wilman Institute's YouTube channel called Baha'i Consultation, a Model for World Governance. So we have another web talk that relates directly to this topic that's good to make people aware of. I don't see any other questions right offhand, and we are now up to the usual time that we stop. So I thought I'd thank you again for your marvelous presentation today and the series that you've been able to give us. And perhaps now, if we go back to my screen, I'll mention some things that are coming up, because I want people to know about our upcoming slides. Thank you again, Reba, for really fascinating presentation. We have next Sunday on the 25th, Shahrokh Monjazeb will be speaking about the Lohe Sultan, the tablet that Baha'u'lláh wrote to Nasir ad-Din Shah. This is the tablet that Badi eventually took to him. That, I think, occurred about a decade after Baha'u'lláh wrote the tablet. And so we'll have quite a presentation about that. It's actually the first of 3 presentations that Shahrokh is going to be doing about the Lohe Sultan, but all 3 of them are for a course that he's doing for us on the Lohe Sultan, and only this first presentation will be public. The other 2, you'll have to sign up for the course in order to watch them. Then, starting Saturday or Sunday, depending on where you're located in the world, the 3rd and 4th of March, we will have a presentation by Mariette Leong. She's the daughter of Hand of the Cause of God Collis Featherstone, and she'll be speaking about her father. You will note that because of the fact that she's in Australia, the presentation will be at 11 a.m. Eastern Australia time on Sunday morning, but for the United States, it will be at 9 p.m. Saturday evening, 6 p.m. Pacific time, Saturday evening. Similarly, a week after that, on Saturday, the 10th of March, she will be giving her second presentation about Hand of the Cause of God, Clara Dunn, whom she met and knew as a child. She'll still be speaking about her, and that's also a presentation which is Saturday evening in the United States and Canada and North America, but it will be Sunday morning in Australia. So if you're located anywhere between almost India and then across the Pacific Ocean to the eastern coast of the United States, you'll be able to watch that live quite conveniently. And if you're in Europe, I'm afraid it'll occur in the middle of the night for you. Then on Sunday, the 25th of March, Robert Weinberg will be giving his presentation about Mark Tobey. This is a presentation that was supposed to happen last week, but we had to postpone it because of some personal matters that Robert had to deal with. In addition to that, I should mention our upcoming courses, which I'll just simply list here. You've got this course by Shahrokh Monjazeb, A Weighty and Gracious Summons to a Despotic Ruler, a study of the Lohe Sultan, which is a 6-week course with 3 presentations. We have a marvelous course called The Baha'i Institutions of Community and the Individual. It starts on March 1st. This is a brand new course. It's a fairly advanced course for the study of the relationship between the nature of the Baha'i institutions and their relationship with the Baha'i community and with the individual. Healthcare and social action follows, and then, of course, on the Tablet of Carmel, the Will and Testament of Al-Baha, and Tablets of the Divine Plan, starting on the 10th of March, and then, of course, on the Baha'i Faith and the Arts, and, of course, on Some Answered Questions. We'll round out our courses in March. So that's a quick summary of what's coming up through the Wilmot Institute. Again, we want to thank Reba for her presentations today and the 2 previous presentations. And we want to thank all of you for participating today. We hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend and look forward to seeing you next week.